This is where the open question needs to remain, though, is we don't know how advanced Atlantis became.
Fair.
And that may be why we have those weird artifacts in the Mediterranean. And I want to add one more thing. We know that Atlantis didn't leave behind any stones with writings in them. It means that they had become advanced enough they were probably doing what we're doing, with at least paper, scrolls and paper and other means. And that just tells us that they were already at a different level. And that doesn't mean it was a good level, because I think that they became too cocky and arrogant. It's described, it's interesting because we have a lot of details of what happened to Atlantis. It's described that Atlantis started as a pure place of incredible knowledge. And then what happened was it became an empire and became warlike. And it describes how it even had slavery going on in North Africa. These are like detailed details, right? And how there was a rival civilization that existed at the same time as them. That was the only one that could stand up to them militarily. Again? The ancient Athenians, like the pre-Greeks, right? Which is why the Greeks and that whole area seem to have this like perfected democracy that seems to have come from nowhere. It describes in that and how they were the birthplace of democracy. The original Athenians, and they weren't using slavery or empire building. And that's why Plato used them as the two examples in the Timaeus and Critias, as well as his other books, because they became the perfect two examples of how one civilization can be corrupted and turn into an empire, and how the other one can still maintain strength, but can maintain their core values. And it describes how Atlantis went to war with the Athenians, and that ultimately the Atlanteans were destroyed during the Earth catastrophes at the end of the Younger Dryas. Plato gives us an exact date.
And do we know how long? Some of this stuff, like there's a lot of details going on, so if there's a couple things you repeat here and there, just bear with me. But do we know how long approximately Atlantis could have lasted for, like when it began, if we know where it ended? The best we can do is, and I placed Atlantis as being created 50,000 years ago. Based on, honestly, largely circumstantial evidence, but we have to put it somewhere. And I base that on geologic history of that region, when things occurred, and I also base it on, I do think that Edgar Cayce, who was a psychic medium, is one of the only few that I actually think was legit throughout history. What makes you think he was legit?
The things he said a lot of them have come true. And
like what?
Like when he discusses aspects of Atlantis and what happened later, it matches up with like archaeological evidence and evidence from that period of what was happening. And it gives credence to the fact that they had recorded as much as they could about this. And then even like the temple priests of Sais were ultimately either killed or died, and the temple was destroyed. And so I want to throw this out there, but if Solon had never visited Egypt, we would never know any of this existed.
Well, that's the other thing, too. When I've heard people in the past talk about Atlantis, there's arguments over when, there's arguments over where, and it seems like it's all over the map. So what, like...
But Plato gives very detailed descriptions of where it is and how big it is and how many rings it has, and that it was located... Basically, Randall breaks it down in his podcast, Randall Carlson, really well, is that, listen, we're pretty sure it was like right where the Azores are. If you go look at bathymetric charts of the seafloor, you can see that there was a plateau of land that was underneath that area that was like wiped out. Now, the descriptions of how it was destroyed is important because it says that it was subducted and sank into the ocean. Now, when we look at plate subduction, plates moving, it's on the mid-Atlantic ridge. Exactly where plates are moving right there. So if we were to have a plate dive under the other one during catastrophe things with the Earth, it literally can take that entire civilization, whatever, and just sink it to the bottom of the ocean, which is exactly how it's described. That's exactly how it's described. And the weird thing, and I want to add one little thing to that, there's this really bizarre set of ruins that validate that. Off of the western tip of Cuba, in the early 2000s, they found these incredibly bizarre ruins at 2,000 feet underwater. Like, you want to pull up something really quick?
Please.
Go look up Sunken City off of Cuba really quick.
Sunken City off of Cuba.
Now, this is what gives credibility to the fact...
Cuban underwater formation?
Click that right there. What that is there was some marine engineers that were hired by the Cuban government.
Holy shit.
Yeah. So there were marine engineers hired by the Cuban government in the early 2000s to go search off of Western Cuba using sonar to find shipwrecks and like gas deposits. And they had no interest in archaeology at all. And what happened was they were surveying 2,000 feet underwater off of Western Cuba in this massive sandy plateau that was literally like miles and miles and miles long with no rocks or anything. And they come across this set of structures that is 11.5 by 11.5 miles.
I'm going to put the picture in the corner of the screen.
Actually, I think it's square. It's square miles or whatever, but the surface area is enormous.
These pyramid-looking things.
So what they found is that they pull out these. They used sonar recreation to create what's on the floor because it's 2,000 feet below the ocean. What they found is
apparently that's not too deep in light of the Titanic.
Yeah, right.
Go down there in a fucking tin can.
What they found is it almost made them not share it because they thought they're going to be ridiculed. They found this, and they used these recreated sonar images, and they were baffled. And Zelinsky is his name. He sat on his computer, I guess, for months. And one day, he had a calendar next to him, and it had a picture of Mayan ruins, and he like freaked out because he realized that this is right off of the Yucatan. It's between the Yucatan and Cuba. Of course, the Mayan civilization is very mysterious, and is supposed to have potential links to Atlantis. He shares this with a geologist named Iturralde in Cuba, who comes out for a second expedition and starts getting the interest of National Geographic. Okay? So Iturralde goes with him. He's a geologist from Cuba, and they go with a submersible to the wreckage, and it dives down, and they analyze it, and he says he's completely baffled by it, and that it's not natural by any means. And that the structures look like a series of streets, temples, pyramids, and if anything, mimics.
Yeah, what's the right? So the right side of this picture again. I'll have that in the corner of the screen. So we have the pyramid-looking things on the left.
Yes.
But is that supposed to be on the right side, like those street patterns?
Yeah, but notice in the bottom part of the image, there's severe destruction. Yeah. Something happened here. There's stuff strewn all over the place. They described it as massive blocks that were strewn all over the ocean floor. Now here's where it gets bizarre. They built the blocks out of what looked like giant granite, just like we see in other parts of the world, and they were cut very precisely. And the geologist said, and this is where I get another theory of Atlantis. Iturralde, the Cuban geologist, says that the only time that part of the ocean could have been different enough geologically would have been 50,000 years ago. He said exactly that number.
That's where, okay. Thank you for watching the video, guys. Please hit that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.